Dr. Stephen Bright, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you here. We were just talking a bit before about kitesurfing. How long have you been kitesurfing for?
I took it up when I moved back to Perth in late 2017. I grew up in Western Australia, learnt to surf in Geraldton, moved to Melbourne, gave up surfing, took up snowboarding, got back, surfed for a while with some old friends, and then realised that there's not much surf in Perth. During the summer, driving down, saw someone on the Swan River and said, that's the sport for Perth.
Yeah. Wow, okay. Did you used to skate when you were a bit younger?
No, just surf.
No, just surf. Okay, yeah, I never really got into surfing. Look, almost all my friends surf, which is a bit weird. I used to skate heaps. But so I reckon a good way to start, we'll get you to introduce yourself and maybe give us a bit of a background on what your field of study is and what you do with yourself.
So my name's Dr. Stephen Bright. I am Senior Lecturer in Addiction at Edith Cowan University. I'm also a Director of the not-for-profit company Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, or PRISM. I'm a Director for Students for Sensible Drug Policy and a founding member of the Australian Psychedelic Society.
Wow, okay. So was there a moment in your life where you decided that that's what you wanted to do with yourself, that you can recollect?
Yeah, I started uni as a mature age student. I was 22, and between the ages of 18 and 21, I joined John Howard's surf team, which is a fancy way of saying I was on the dole.
Oh, right. I've never heard of it.
Yeah, wrong generation.
Yeah, okay.
And, I just realised I needed to get out of town. I needed to change. I knew I wanted to do something in relation to assisting people with alcohol and other drug-related issues, because that was what my experience was living in town. I spoke to one of my parents' friends who suggested, don't become an alcohol and other drug counsellor or a drug counsellor. What you want to do is do social work, psychology, something like that. If you do that, all these other doors will open. And so, I thought psychology, I'll have a crack at that, and really got into it.
Yeah, wow, okay. So how did psychedelics become a part of what you chose to really focus on?
It was serendipitous. I moved to Melbourne maybe 15 years ago, and around that time my area of research was novel psychoactive drugs. There are all these new drugs that were entering the illicit market, and in fact at that time they weren't illicit, they were legal. Things like mephedrone, the bath salts.
Methadone used to be legal.
Mephedrone was legal, yeah.
Wow, okay.
People were you could go to the Fremantle market and buy a capsule of mephedrone for $2.
Wow, which is methadone's used for heroin addiction.
That's methadone.
Methadone.
People have died from getting that mistake, because a dose of methadone is a couple of milligrams, and a dose of mephedrone is about same as MDMA.
Oh, okay, like 100 milligrams.
Yeah, milligrams. Yeah. And so people that have accidentally ordered methadone thinking it was methadone have died and overdosed over in the UK. Mephedrone is similar to MDMA. It's kind of like, it's similar in structure to MDMA, so similar in effect.
A stimulant type drug?
Yeah, stimulant type drug. The best description I can provide is that it's kind of like a cross between MDMA and cocaine.
Right, okay. So you get it's a bit more of an intense sort of stimulant feeling, but you still do get like a bit of the empathic sort of effects.
And depends route of administration. So if you take it orally, it's more empathogenic and tactogenic. If you're snorting it, it's more cocaine-like. And this stuff was just like freely available at Freo Market.
Wow.
And so I'd moved to Melbourne, and I wanted to talk about this and sort of present the results from my research, but I didn't want to do it at a mainstream conference, because I knew what would happen. There would be moral panic in the media and it'd all be banned. Yeah. And so I found this conference called Entheogenesis Australis, which I knew nothing about at the time, but it looked like a cool place where I could maybe present this information and put it out there and get some feedback on sort of what other people's thoughts were. And I had no idea what I was turning up to. It's still running today, Entheogenesis, longest standing Australian psychedelic organisation.
Wow.
The conference I went to had representation from the US, from Johns Hopkins, There was Bear I can never say his name. Bear Stanley Owl. He was basically the guy that was making the acid that was at Woodstock in the 60s.
Wow. Okay.
So he was giving
Pretty
a talk.
prolific figure.
Yeah, like these were prolific figures, and I had no idea of the research that was happening at Johns Hopkins at the time. So I was exposed to it that way. I went back to their conference the next year, and because I just got so excited about psychedelics after going to this conference, and put in an abstract to do a keynote, and they picked it up. So I was I think I was first off the rung to present. It was basically they wanted to use me as a nice way to sort of pull all the information together as to what's been happening in the last few years in the world of international psychedelic science. And it just happened that Rick Doblin from the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which has been doing all this great work with MDMA, was one of the keynotes there as well.
Wow. Okay.
To the point, he was in the front row, and I was talking about MDMA at the time, and I was sort of looking at Rick going, have I got that right, Rick? Looking at him for a bit of reassurance.
Like,
all good. And at the end of that conference, there was a meeting held with all the key people that were at the conference. And basically, Rick talked us into saying that we could replicate the research that they'd just presented, the first phase 1 clinical trial of Mdma Assisted Psychotherapy for PTSD. We could do that here in Australia, and he's very charismatic. And so he talked us up and talked us into believing that this was something that we could do, and that's pretty much where my journey started.
Yeah, well, okay. So do you feel like Australia, just in terms of our drug policy, has always sort of been lacking behind compared to, say, some other countries like in Europe or the US?
It depends when and where you look at our drug policy, because... Well, for one, Australia, up until 1950, you used to be able to buy heroin from the pharmacy in Australia. We were one of the last countries. Yes, we were one of the last countries to prohibit heroin.
Yeah, okay.
And in the UK, heroin's still used in hospitals, so it is still a medication. Australia was very progressive in 85, 86, because Bob Hawke was a Prime Minister at the time.
Yeah.
His daughter had a problem with heroin.
Wow.
And what he could see was that what we were doing was not working. And so he said, we need to do something different. He held a drug summit. He got all of the medical experts, people who were using drugs, pretty much everybody had a voice at this drug summit, and that led to what was a paradigm change in terms of drug policy internationally. We call it now the National Drug Strategy in Australia, but it's based on this idea of harm minimisation, and within that is harm reduction. So Australia was one of the first countries to allow the distribution of clean injecting equipment.
For free as well, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, for free and legally. Even some states in the US have only allowed legal distribution of that in the last few years. So on one hand, we've been extremely progressive when it comes to drug policy, and on the other, things like heroin-assisted therapy they proposed to do that in the ACT in the late 90s. Howard was in at the time and rejected it on the basis it would be sending the wrong message. We've seen drug checking, or most people call it pill testing. Yeah. It's been a really hard slog to get that up and happening in Australia.
Because obviously since COVID, like the whole festival thing sort of slowed down a bit. But before then, pill testing was like a massive thing of discussion, right, a few years ago. Do you feel like there's been any change in sort of like the attitude towards pill testing?
There's definitely been some. So just to briefly talk you through my journey with pill testing, I was helping out at festivals in Victoria providing harm reduction services, primarily trip-sitting people that were having a challenging experience.
Who were just freaking out.
Yeah, they were freaking out. And in 2017, it was the last Rainbow I went to, and
Rainbow Serpent Festival.
Correct. Yeah.
I'd love to go to that one day. That'd be very cool.
I would highly recommend it. Highly recommend it.
So you were a psychedelic trance fan?
Well, I wasn't really until I kept going up there because I'd be looking after people and they'd be saying, you know, what have you come here to listen to? And I'm like, I've got no idea. I've come here to look after you, mate. That's why I'm here. I'm here to look after you. But in 2017, I actually they had Spongel playing and Solar Fields.
I'm a massive Spongel fan. Fuck yeah.
And so I did the harm reduction work. I did some panels with Richard Di Natale, the Greens leader at the time, and also let my hair down when Spongel and Solar Fields were on.
Cool. Yeah, wow. So pill testing, because obviously like without sort of the decriminalization of MDMA, which would be like the typical thing you would be testing, right, for pill testing. You obviously find, like, especially with press pills, if you aren't taking like caps with like pure MDMA, did you find that if people who they thought they were taking MDMA with caps would actually be taking other stuff along with it, even though they were sort of, you know, under the guise that they thought they were taking pure MDMA? Yeah,
so what makes this 2017 rainbow so significant for me is not just Spongel. Just a couple of weeks before that, myself and a colleague had been able to identify that caps going around were containing 25 cm, 4 fluoroamphetamine, and a little bit of MDMA.
Wow, okay.
People had died in Melbourne in Chapel Street, and we were able to obtain a sample, get it sent to Spain for GCMS, which is fancy way of saying very fancy drug checking, and they identified what was in it. Around the same time, a police memo was linked, so we knew that the police knew about it before we knew about it, but we were the ones that were breaking it because they didn't want to put that information out. They were worried about what that information would do. That created a lot of controversy. And so we're at this festival and we're camping with the same colleague that had these drugs checked, and with a bunch of other people there that were drug nerds, and every 20 minutes, 10 minutes, someone would come by our camp and say, you want to buy some drugs? And say, maybe, can we test them first? Because we had all the reagent testing equipment with us, and we'd test it, come up MDMA, and we'd say, oh, thanks, maybe come back later.
Yeah, okay.
After 24 hours, we tested a sample that came up with PMA, which has been associated with a number of ecstasy-related deaths. Primarily because it takes about 2 hours to come on, so people
just end up eating more.
Yeah, they eat more and then they die. And so we approached the festival, the organisers, and the emergency controller was ex-law enforcement, and I remember him. Today, I can remember him saying to us, you don't want people to die here. We don't want people to die here. Just start doing this. Can you do it at your camp? And I said, I'm not sure they'd be cool with that. But we managed to work with one of the services that were on site and just sort of do it back of house.
Wow.
Got the word out, tested hundreds of samples, and the PMA was what triggered it, but in fact what we ended up identifying was heaps of this same gear that was going around Chapel Street. It was caps, it looked like MDMA. We had people that were presenting sick, saying, look, I've already taken it, but can you just test it anyway?
Yeah.
And we didn't have the internet up there, so we couldn't confirm, but we kind of saw this pattern and we said, you know, we think this is what it might be. It's this gear that's going around Chapel Street. It looks similar in the way that it's coming up in the different reagent tests. And pretty much everybody just threw that gear in the bin.
Wow.
And we were able to confirm it. There was a student at the festival that decided to take one of those pills out of the bin and sent it to Spain, got it analysed and confirmed it was exactly the same batch that was going around.
Wow.
So potentially prevented a number of deaths at the festival. But more so, what I learnt from it was that the actual testing itself, the technology is not important. What was important is it created an opportunity to have conversations with people. And so when...
without the fear of like being essentially getting in trouble.
Yeah, well, I mean, even the volunteers, I didn't actually do the testing myself because that would be illegal. And so I got a group together and said, look, this is the situation. This is what we'd like to do. If you participate, you will be breaking the law. And everybody said, yeah, we're happy to break the law. We're going to do this.
Wow. And
then I was just sort of overseeing it, if you like. I wasn't touching any drugs. I was overseeing it and helping people interpret the results. So a result came out with 2CE, which is kind of like a mescaline compound.
Yeah, which is like, it's sort of like, it's similar to 2CB. Am I correct? No?
Not really. It's much longer acting.
Okay,
It's very psychedelic. Where 2CB is more like trypstasy. This is more like LSD, and that was the way I explained it to the punter. I said it takes a while to come on.
Yeah.
It's kind of like
and you're
LSD.
Gonna be tripping for a while.
You're going to be tripping for a while. And the person said, well, I'm so glad I know that, because I thought I was taking MDMA, and if I'd have started tripping, that I would have had a bad time. I had a bad time.
Wow.
And so he said, look, I'm going to keep it, but I'm just going to take half and see what happens. And to me, that's a positive outcome.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so you mentioned 25C NBME, I believe. Yeah, so a few years ago, there was a whole bunch of 25I NBME, I believe it was, that was going around. I'd had a few experiences on it and absolutely hated it, but there was a dude who went to my school at Churchlands, Preston Bridge.
Yep.
Yeah, he's I've met his family a few times, and I'm friends with a bunch of people that he was friends with. Yeah, and that was like the first time I think I'd ever really seen a headline in like where I lived that was related to psychedelic drugs, where you were like, holy fuck, like that's probably one of the most tragic things I've ever heard in relation to somebody, you know, just thinking that they're going to be having a good time and then accidentally falling off of a balcony.
Yeah, for me, what went wrong there was a lack of education, because 25I NBOME it was a research chemical back then.
And people were selling it saying it was LSD, but as soon as you put it on your tongue, you can taste it.
Bitter.
It tastes like shit.
If it's bitter, it's a spitter. That's the
spit it out.
That's the terminology we came up with over East. If it's bitter, it's a spitter.
Yeah.
So that lack of education, lack of information. Because I think if people were more aware, my understanding is with Preston's case, they had ordered it specifically online as 25I NBOME as cheap acid.
Yep.
So they knew they were taking NBOME, they knew they were rolling a dice, but probably didn't know just how much they were rolling the dice.
Yeah.
Because it was literally a research chemical that was developed to understand the 5-HT2A receptor site of the serotonin.
Could you go a little bit more in depth with what that is?
So there's lots of different neurotransmitters in the brain: dopamine, endorphins, endocannabinoids, serotonins. So serotonin's 5-HT, 5-hydroxytryptamine, and there's a specific receptor site, the 5-HT2A receptor site, which is thought to be associated with producing the visual effects that we experience when we take psychedelic drugs. And so they developed a chemical that would bind to this site really tight and hard. And looked at it in animals and did a bunch of research on it. Somebody must have read a paper and said, wonder what happens if you give that to humans. And all of a sudden it just hit the market.
Yeah. So the impacts of another great psychedelic and point of discussion that a lot of people like talking about is dimethyltryptamine. Have you done much study or research into that?
Absolutely, and there was some element of DMT that was my interest in DMT was kind of happening on the side before I even had gone to the EGA conference. I had a friend that grew up with surfing. Things had broken down in our friendship relationship due to just like it was over $100 or something. It was to do with something to do with drugs back when I was 19, 20. Our relationship sort of fell apart. We reconnected again once I'd been studying. I was doing my PhD at the time. And we'd reconnected, and one day he said, so you're teaching these students about drugs? You teach them about DMT? And I said, no, what's DMT? And he went on to sort of describe what it was and how to extract it and everything else. And I think I felt a number of feelings. One, I was annoyed that I was meant to be a drug expert and I'd never come across it.
Idea what it was.
No, and so I made sure from there on in, every one of my students was going to know what DMT is. It's in all of my lectures now. And the other was, I guess, a sense of cautious anxiety around having a DMT experience, because doing my PhD, I'd kind of just sorted out my ontology in terms of what's reality and what's not reality, and I didn't think DMT was a really good idea in terms of challenging something that I just kind of firmed up and was writing my PhD on at the time.
Yeah, wow, okay. So is it, I'm not sure if this is true, but the way that the brain works when you go into REM sleep and you produce, I'm not sure what the chemicals are in the brain that puts you into that sort of hallucinogenic state when you sleep. Does DMT get produced by the brain when you sleep?
We don't know.
Don't know? Okay.
There's a lot of theories. We don't know why. We don't know why the brain produces DMT. We don't know, and even that's speculative in terms of whether the brain's producing it or not. The more interesting question is, where can't you find DMT? Because it's in grass, it's in food, we're eating it. There's monoamine oxidase enzymes that break it down, because otherwise we'd be tripping all the time. So it's hard to know whether the DMT that's in our brain is being produced by our brain, or it's coming at us through the plants and animals that we consume. So we don't know. We really don't know a lot about DMT. What we do know is the way it works in terms of its subjective effect is the same as LSD, mescaline and psilocybin, in that it binds to that 5-HT2A receptor site.
Wow, okay. So you touched on your PhD just before, and if I've done my research correctly, that was on the media's interpretation of and narrative surrounding psychedelic drugs. Is that correct?
Not so much psychedelics, but just
drugs
alcohol and other drugs in general. Because I guess I was looking at it, I was seeing that the media were presenting a particular picture of alcohol and other drugs, and that didn't seem to fit with the science. And so I wanted to understand why the media was limited to framing the stories the way they did, the way the narrative seemed to always be the same. And so my PhD basically showed that they were limited by these discourses that were that it's a complex concept. But the easiest way I can explain it is that there are institutions within our society that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, because that maintains their power in society. So medical institutions, so they're going
Big
to
pharma, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, well, they all fit within that medical discourse, and so they present drugs as pathogens. And if you're exposed to that pathogen, then you may cause harm, or you develop the disease of addiction. There are other institutions like the church, which sees it as a moral failing, for example, and there's stories of redemption in the media, where people redeem themselves from drug use, or even where the drugs themselves are deemed to have some sort of agency. And I see this with methamphetamine, where people think, methamphetamine is just a molecule.
Yeah,
it's just a
drug.
chemical. It's what the person does with that molecule that leads or to harm or not harm. And so
so meth essentially just has like a marketing problem.
Well, look, I try not to be druggist.
Yeah.
But there's two drugs that I don't like, just because of the impact that it has on people's health, and that's alcohol, tobacco, and third one would be meth.
Meth, okay, wow. Yeah, so a lot of people, like I've known a lot of people who have used methamphetamine and absolutely lost their fucking minds on it. And it does for sure have a massive impact on mental health, but also just like I've also had family members on certain sides of my family who have been to jail for methamphetamine use and possession and all that sort of thing. And it just finds its way into every single part of society. Another interesting drug would be cocaine as well, because you see, particularly if you spend time with people who are like upper middle class and high levels in high socioeconomically, cocaine just appears to be like fucking everywhere. Why do you reckon that is?
Well, I think it's a status symbol in Australia, and the data shows now that cocaine is the second most used illicit drug after cannabis.
Wow.
It used to be MDMA, now cocaine, and so Australia has a higher rate of per capita use of cocaine, at least pre-COVID, than the US. So in
the world.
In the world, yeah.
So could you pull that up for us, Leo? Is Australia the largest cannabis user, just so people at home can say that?
Cocaine.
Cocaine, sorry. Yeah, cocaine.
I think we're the largest cannabis users as well.
Yeah, wow.
We love drugs in Australia. I find this really interesting because there was a story recently in the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald talking about, I don't know her name, she's a footballer's wife who had, there's some footage of her in Melbourne appearing to be snorting a white powder off a Kmart plate. It's been identified that the plate was from Kmart. And this article was really saying, you know, why should we be surprised? Why is this person even apologising? You know, it's every time a celebrity gets caught using cocaine, they have this big apology, and we all act surprised, like, oh my God, they're using cocaine.
Yeah. Even though you know like 50 other people who are using it. Like,
exactly, and that's what this journalist actually said, is that so many Australians use cocaine.
Yeah, well, okay. So that, it's not up to date.
No, we've got 2019 data.
Yeah, because I do remember reading an article. Yeah, it was making its way around the news a couple of months ago.
June 20th.
Highest per capita cocaine users in the world. Wow.
Yeah.
It's an interesting accolade. Yeah, wow. Okay. So cocaine, methamphetamine. What sort of stuff have you been doing in terms of magic mushrooms and psilocybin study?
Other than being an amateur mycologist while I was living in Victoria, I mean, it's incredible living over there. It's very different here in Western Australia. You know, you got bailing up. At my hospital, I would go for walks around the park at lunchtime and see people collecting mushrooms.
Over east?
Yeah, in Melbourne.
Wow.
So next to my hospital, there was a park, and they like wood chip, and so there's wood chip gardens everywhere. You'd be crossing the road. There's mushrooms growing in the middle of the road.
Wow.
Once you know what you're looking for, you realise they're everywhere. And so I used to have a bit of fun with people over at the park, because it'd be at that point I was managing an alcohol and other drug service with 50 staff and a $3-4 million annual budget, and so I'd often be wearing a suit, tie. And I would see them with their little green Woolworths bag walking around the park.
Full of mushies.
I know what they're doing. And so I'd go and find one, I'd pick one, I'd grab it, and then I'd just V-line them really fast, with full eye contact the whole time. And when I got right up to their face, I'd say, are you looking for one of these?
They looked a little bit shocked.
And they would be, they're sweating and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And then I'd have
think you're a cop. Yeah.
Then I'd explain what I do and do a bit of harm reduction with them, like explain to them that just because it turns blue doesn't mean it's a psilocybe mushroom. You know, it can be sprayed with there's various pesticides that are being used around here.
Okay.
So and link them up with EGA and PRISM and various other harm reduction resources.
Yeah, wow, okay. So, like, here in WA, like, I've been picking before down south, and there's, like, a lot of people say that mushrooms like to, or particularly psilocybin, like to grow on cow shit, right? Is that true? Because I've never seen it in WA.
No.
You just see them, like, in fields and stuff, and there's just fucking thousands of them, but I've never seen any cow dung.
So that's a particular species, Psilocybe cubenus, which in the tropical parts of Australia does grow in cow dung, but the variety that we see in the colder parts of Australia, the wood lovers, Psilocybe, I can't say it, Subaringosia. Is the
weird
closest
science names.
Or subs for short. The subs grow in wood as their substrate. So if you're in Queensland looking for mushrooms in summer, then they do. You will find them in cow dung, but not here in Perth and not in Melbourne either.
Yeah, wow, okay. Yeah, so have you done any looking into not psychoactive mushrooms, so the other ones like lion's mane, turkey tail, all those sort of things? Have you done much research into that?
Not really. I mean, I've heard anecdotal reports. One of the things I used to really enjoy, other than scaring people in Melbourne at the park, was going out into the forest myself with my partner and friends, and we'd go collect gourmet mushrooms. So there's various species of mushrooms growing in the wild that are edible. And honestly, growing up in Perth or in Western Australia at least, we're told about toadstools and to be scared of mushrooms. And so the ones that you actually eat that are gourmet mushrooms, if you saw them growing, you would think that's a toadstool. I wouldn't eat that.
Okay.
And so it was a good experience to be sort of shown how to pick different mushrooms, how to distinguish them, and develop a relationship with mushrooms in terms of not being afraid of them, being cautious. Obviously, there's certainly, in fact, the things that. The mushrooms that look like the ones that you buy from the store, they're actually the most dangerous. They're the hardest to distinguish between.
Oh, so they all look very similar.
Yeah, they start looking very similar,
Wow.
and they're the ones I actually would need. I might do a spore print and see if they have the right colour. But even after then, I'd be like, I'm not sure if that's the right species.
Yeah.
I'm not going to take the risk.
So what's like the number of deaths per year in Australia that people who pick mushrooms and stuff and accidentally pick up toxic ones? Is it quite a large number of people?
Yeah, I'd be guessing around somewhere between 5 to 10 every year.
Oh, 5 to 10, right? Okay.
5 to 10 people.
Yeah.
So it's. I mean, that's still dead people.
That's people.
And usually it's usually often the ACT, parts of New South Wales, people that have come from Asia and are used to picking mushrooms in Asia. And unfortunately, the death cap looks very much like a mushroom that grows in Asia. And so they accidentally pick the death cap, eat it, and die.
Wow, fuck. What are some of the symptoms if you eat a toxic mushroom?
It really depends on the mushroom that you eat.
Okay.
So anything from just a bit of nausea through to, with that particular Amanita mushroom, which is called the death cap, the symptoms are basically liver failure.
Wow.
And so it's really awful. It takes people about 3 days to die from it. So it's not a pleasant death. Yeah.
Death.
And unless you can get a liver transplant, there's really nothing that science and medicine can do for you.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, wow, that's shocking. So why is it that mushrooms, like even edible mushrooms and like mushroom extract, like lion's mane stuff, and psilocybin, why is it that they generally do upset the stomach when you eat them?
I don't know.
Well, that's just been my experience.
Yeah, I was going to say, because it's not my experience.
Yeah.
Certainly with, I'm not a huge mushroom fan. My partner is, and she could live off mushrooms without it upsetting her stomach, and yet other things will upset her stomach. I think there's a lot of individual variation, a lot of individual difference. And one key thing I think when it comes to magic mushrooms and body load is... one is the species. So if they are picked locally, the subs, they can carry a bit of body load because of other chemicals that the mushroom produces.
Okay.
Or the substrate it's growing in. Mushrooms are literally sponges. They will just, if there are poisons in the ground, they will extract them. Whereas if you're buying or consuming something that's been sort of more commercially grown in someone's closet,
a lot more organic.
Yeah, it'll be a cubenus, and you have to have sterile environment to be able to cultivate cubenus. So the cubenus tends to have less body load because it's not picking up those natural things that are in the ground. Some of which are probably good for us, some of them which are not so good for us.
Is it easy to grow mushrooms, whether or not they be psilocybin or edible mushrooms? Is it like an easy process?
Absolutely. Yeah. Particularly edible mushrooms are very easy to grow. You can go to Bunnings and just buy a little box and they'll start growing.
Wow.
If you want to grow wood lovers, it's a little bit more complex because you have to play with the temperature and... if you're growing them outside of an area where they naturally grow, then you have to artificially change the temperature.
So like a hydroponic setup, but for mushrooms in a way.
Yeah, not even like a hydroponic setup. You could have a Hessian bag with some wood chip in it, put some spores in there, just wet it. If you're living in Melbourne, 12 months later, all of a sudden there'll be subs growing out of it everywhere.
Wow.
The spores disperse. That's how the mushrooms get about. Is the spores disperse so widely, so much so that if you if you collect some mushrooms and say bring them home for analysis, the next year you'll have them growing in your backyard because the spores
they just spread absolutely everywhere. Wow.
And so some people say that might be one of the reasons why these mushrooms produce psilocybin is it's evolutionarily advantageous for the mushroom because we like to pick them and we then spread them.
It's interesting you bring up evolution. Obviously, being a psychedelics guy, you've probably heard of the stoned ape hypothesis.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that?
It's possible.
I would love it to be possible. That'd be so fucking cool.
It's possible. I think there's so many theories out there though when it comes to psychedelics and their role in human evolutionary and society. There's the hypothesis that the spores may have even come from outer space.
I've heard of that.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
There's thoughts that psychedelics were used that basically formed a lot of what now we call religions.
Yeah.
They were formed through the use of psychedelics where people had the experience, they wrote about these experiences, and we moved away from a culture in which we had the experience into a culture where we read about other people's experiences. But there's a lot of data suggests that all of the religions really came from psychedelic use.
Wow, that's crazy.
And we've just sort of distanced ourselves from them. And the church actually, I think today doesn't like psychedelic drugs because in the Christian church, you go to the church to commune with God via a priest. Well, if you've got mushrooms and you can dial a direct line, why would you go to church?
Makes religion completely obsolete. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I've always sort of thought that, I mean, you don't have to be practicing religion and the belief in a higher power and God. People sort of tend to just put them together, but I sort of believe that they're two very, very separate things. Like you don't actually need to be subscribed to a religious dogma in order to believe in a higher power. But yeah, that's really crazy. I hadn't heard of the like how would a mushroom spore be able to come onto Earth, like through a meteorite?
Exactly.
Like
yeah.
Wow. Fuck.
And there's evidence of things coming. You know, that they've dissected meteorites and found interesting things that shouldn't be there, like amino acids.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of when you go into the esoteric theories, there's lots of really interesting stuff out there. Like you talked about, the difference between religion and what I would say is spirituality, which is that there is something out there, but I'm not really sure what it is. Well, that's more agnostic actually, but some people from psychedelic experiences, psychedelics induce this mystical state, which involves a sense of feeling at one, that everything is interconnected, or that you're actually communing directly with some God or higher intelligence or whatever you want to call that, Gaia if you want. And, people have, for thousands of years have tried to explain that, and some of it's been explained through the religious texts that we have now. And we're continuing to try to understand it now through, the neuroscientists are saying that we shouldn't even be calling it a mystical experience because that suggests there's some sort of supernatural element. And in neuroscience, it's all about the objectivity. It's the science. Okay. But then, as a psychologist, there's lots of different theories as to what might be going on. One might be that that the brain is an antennae for consciousness. So there is this broader consciousness that we exist in. And,
so you're like a TV just receiving a
signal.
Yeah,
we're receiving the signal for consciousness. And what psychedelics do is dissolve our ego, and you realise that actually I am you and you are me, and we are all one. We're just this one conscious being, and the ego that I have, my personality, me, is just an illusion.
Yeah, I can't say I've ever experienced a complete ego death on psychedelics, but I have heard that it is quite profound. Couldn't imagine what that would be fucking like. But I'm not sure if you know this, but I'm pretty sure the largest living organism is a mushroom, right? Could you search this up for a second? It's like the size of Texas or something crazy like that.
Yeah, they did DNA testing and they just kept going wider and wider and wider and wider, and kept confirming that it was the same. This gets weird as well. Is it an animal? Is it a plant? No, it's neither. We don't know where fungi really fit into the plant animal kingdom. It's got its own thing going on there. So they did the genetic testing, and essentially the really interesting thing with mushrooms actually is that what you see is the fruiting body. What we call a mushroom is just like an orange. It's the fruit.
But not the actual plant itself.
No,
Yeah,
so the
okay.
plant or the animal, whatever you want to call it, is actually the mycelium, which is running underneath the ground. And
Yeah.
these networks are incredibly complex.
And they communicate with each other.
They
in many
communicate
ways.
with
Yeah.
each other. They communicate with trees. They will connect with roots of trees and pass on chemicals to one another so that they will help each other out. Or
Wow.
if the tree is identified as being parasitic, then they'll all of a sudden turn on the tree and kill the tree and get rid of the tree.
Wow.
And so there's this symbiotic relationship between fungi and plants and animals going on that we're completely unaware of. This is happening right now. All around the world this is happening, and we don't really know it's happening because we can't see it because the mycelium are running underneath the ground, so we don't see that. All we see is every now and then they fruit, and you see the mushroom, and the point of the mushroom, like a fruit in a plant, it's to get the seeds out, which in this
to
case
spread
is
itself
spores.
even further. Yeah, I'm not sure if you've heard of the game, The Last of Us. Have you heard of that? The alien creatures. Well, no, they're not aliens. Like, it's about this game where something spreads amongst like the human population. They all turn into these weird monsters and shit. But it's actually inspired from a real mushroom that infects ants and stuff. I'm not sure if you've heard about that.
Yeah, very familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the mushroom, the spore gets into an insect, and then the mycelium network starts setting up inside the insect, so that the mycelium or the fungi, the actual I can't think of another way of describing mycelium. What is it? It's this complex network that it develops, but it connects in with the insect's central nervous system, so it can start to control the insect, and it controls the ant to go up to the top of its ant nest, and then kills the ant, and then puts its spores
Spreads
everywhere,
itself
so
out.
all of the ants get infected with it.
Yeah, it's fucking absolutely crazy. Would that be possible with humans to do? Do you feel?
I don't know. I think
Like, could you synthesize something to be able to do that?
I don't know if you certainly couldn't synthesize something to do it, but I don't know the answer. I think for me, what makes this mycelium so interesting is the complexity of it. So the networks that I was talking about that are communicating with trees and potentially animals, and you know that example with the ants, those networks are as complex as our brain. They're incredibly complex, and so if we think about networks, there's I guess there's a universe, we've got our brain, and then we've got these weird mycelium things happening all around the world, and those networks could potentially be forming memories in the same way that our brains form memories by changing the structure of the network. For us, it's neuron structure, but for mycelium, it's they just grow out in different ways, and cross paths with other species. And there's almost an intelligence there that we're not aware of.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, like, obviously compared to like human level intelligence, it's like minute in many ways. But yeah, there's definitely something. I don't know if you would call it like mystical, because that's sort of getting into like metaphysical sort of terminology. But yeah, definitely something that I don't think we'll probably ever be able to understand completely. And yeah, it's very fascinating.
I'm agnostic. I am open to different ideas, and I'm not closed off to different ideas. And so, I can't remember what you just said. In terms of it being the conscious being mystic. I mean, some people would say that that experience with psilocybin mushrooms is the mushroom communicating with us. In the same way that ayahuasca is the plants communicating with us.
Yeah, and you have lots of anecdotal stories of people, particularly on ayahuasca, but also mushrooms, of having like alien beings like talking to them and trying to communicate with them in many ways, which is also incredibly fascinating. Which sort of like ties into the idea that maybe when you are taking psychedelic drugs and tripping, that you are sort of being like, your consciousness is being projected into another place for a certain amount of time. That's actually like it's not tangible, you can't touch it, but because actual real beings and consciousnesses communicating with you in many ways.
Yeah, well,
Crazy.
I mean, that, Rick Strassman really kicked off the psychedelic science renaissance that we're in the midst of at the moment by administering DMT to people, and he did very basic science, but the book he wrote from it documented those experiences. And initially, he said to participants as they were coming out of the DMT experience, so what was happening, and they'd sort of say, well, I went to this other dimension and there was an entity communicating with me. And he said, okay, so it felt like you went to another dimension. And they said, no, dude, you weren't there. Yeah. I was there. Yeah. I went to another dimension. It's a place. Yeah. I was there. You weren't there. And so he was, being a good psychiatrist, he went, okay, well, I'll just run with this. So the next patient, instead of saying it felt like, he just said, tell me about this place, and documented it all, wrote it up in the spirit molecule. And he's since come up with a hypothesis.
Was that the recent documentary, The Spirit Molecule? On
it was based on his research in his book called The Spirit Molecule. And he's since written a book where he's proposed that people that have had alien encounter experiences might be due to the endogenous release of dimethyltryptamine in the brain.
Due to stress.
For whatever reason, people are, whether it, like you asked, is it to do with dreaming? We don't know what's going on. We don't even know if the brain produces it or not. But if it is producing it and all of a sudden your brain dumps a lot of it, then you could have a alien experience and believe that you had been, abducted. And the experiences that people describe from both smoking DMT and ayahuasca are very similar to alien abduction stories.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, like, acid flashbacks are a real thing. So could you potentially, maybe not just with acid, but you could take like a lot of psychedelics when you're really young, and then like in a couple of decades when you sort of just, you aren't taking drugs anymore, you sort of had that part of your life, and then all of a sudden you could just be thrown straight back into a trip. Is that a real thing?
Kind of. So most people will report at some point, if they've used quite a lot of psychedelics, having a flashback, and most of those people report that it's a positive experience because they're listening to a tune and all of a sudden it fires up that network that was the same network that was firing when they were on MDMA in a club, and they feel really good. Insanely good. And ecstatic dance, and you can create these ecstatic states without psychoactive drugs, but if you've had them before, then it's easier to bring on those states. And so for most people it's a positive thing. For the people that do have flashbacks that are reporting that it's negative, it's usually because they have had a really challenging time, and it's similar to PTSD and the way people have flashbacks there. So it's almost like they've had a traumatic experience, and something then triggers that traumatic experience in the same way as PTSD, and they have a flashback similar to a PTSD flashback.
Wow. So interesting that you bring up PTSD. So I've got a lot of family members who have been in the military and served for the country essentially. Have you done any work with Mdma Assisted Ptsd Therapy with veterans or anything like that?
Well, I've been working on it for 10 years. We're very close. But unfortunately, it's not veterans in this instance. Our first effort was in 2011 after meeting Rick Doblin. We pulled together a protocol, submitted it to ethics. Unfortunately, it was rejected because we were trying to replicate what they were doing in the US, and the Australian healthcare system and the university sector is very different to that in the US. And so we got some good feedback. It was disappointing that we'd spent $3,000 on applying to the ethics committee, but we got some feedback that was then useful. And that particular example, we were focusing on war veterans with PTSD because we thought this was a smart thing to focus on, because so many Australian soldiers are not dying overseas from...
They're committing suicide.
Exactly. Yeah. They're killing themselves, and it's primarily due to PTSD. And so we thought it was smart and strategic to focus on war veterans. And then we had another crack in 2015 with Deakin University. We basically did everything we got told from the ethics committee to do. We worked with a different psychiatrist this time. Before it even got to the ethics committee, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research stepped in and said, not at our university, we're not doing this research here. Wow. And so what I learned from that was you need to go to the top of the chain first, ask for permission before you go submitting to the ethics committee. So when I got to ECU in late 2017, early 2018, I contacted my DVCR. I knew he had a background in medicine, sent a couple of papers, and he just responded saying, "Why aren't we doing this in Australia?" And I said, "Yes, exactly, mate, exactly. Let's do this in Australia." And ECU have been really supportive in terms of getting a trial underway here in Perth. It's been slow because while ECU's got an appetite to do, novel and innovative things as a young university, they don't have the processes in place like UWA to run clinical trials.
Yeah, okay.
And so I've really had to, with the assistance of staff at ECU, we've had to really build everything from the bottom up to be able to run this clinical trial. But we're at a point now where we've got ethics approval to go ahead with it. I've undergone the MDMA training, which was incredible, hands down the best training I've ever done in my life as a psychologist. I'm now licensed, along with my couple of very few colleagues that I won't name, to possess MDMA and administer MDMA.
Yeah. How controlled is that? Like, are you just being like consistently surveyed and like asked questions all the time?
I feel like all I do at the moment is fill out electronic paperwork.
Yeah.
People ask me, what do you if you want to be a psychedelic researcher, what's the number one thing you need to know or be good at? And I say, well, typing. You need to be good at typing because you're going to be doing a lot of paperwork.
Wow.
And so we have to be able to have the permit that I have, we had to install a separate safe in the hospital I'm working with because you can't store the MDMA with any of the other medications, be it morphine, fentanyl, all of those. It's got to be in a separate safe on its own that only the permit holders have a key to. So there's just a small group of us that have access to this safe. Doesn't have MDMA in it yet. We've got,
but it will.
It will. We're hoping to have it in Perth by November. So we've already got a import license from the Office of Drug Control at the TGA, and we've just got the last step is to get the actual application through to import that particular quantity of MDMA into that safe at this particular time.
Wow. So yeah, obviously heavily regulated at this time.
Yeah. So the safe, to meet WA standards, it's 24-hour CCTV monitoring. Look, we're actually not importing that much MDMA. It's about 3.5 grams for the trial that we're running.
A ball. Wow.
But and look,
that's not much.
It's not much.
Yeah, that's not much.
And earlier this year, late last year, when the Department of Health knocked back our first application because we were just hoping to store it in the same safe as the other, where amphetamines were stored and things like that. We thought, that's secure enough. My argument back was just that, it's 3.5 grams. Seriously, who's going to break into a pharmacy to steal 3.5 grams of MDMA? There's still all the other drugs that are in the safe and leave the MDMA behind because you can buy that for nothing in Northbridge. Yeah. But then she pointed out, the chief pharmacist in Western Australia pointed out that, it might be, but it's also, GCMP, or good, it's pharmaceutical grade MDMA that you're holding. So
cooked in a legitimate laboratory, under people who actually know what they're doing. Wow. So really, really high grade MDMA. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but once it goes over 84% in purity, doesn't it turn into like a weird gooey consistency? Is that bullshit?
That's bullshit.
Okay.
The MDMA we're importing is 99.99% MDMA.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. Because everybody back in the day that I used to hang out with would talk about it, and they think they know all that shit. They're like, if it goes over 84%, turns into a goo, and I was like, okay, I believe that. But
that's to do with probably there could be some truth to it. Like anything, there's always a kernel of truth there, and I think probably the kernel of truth there would be the synthesis process. And so, based on the synthesis pathway, there's only a certain you can only get it to a certain level of purity with that synthesis pathway. But if you've got access to a proper pharmaceutical laboratory and you're not doing it in a clandestine situation, then you can produce 99.99% pure.
Wow, that would be fucking crazy. So what? Because you can get clear looking MDMA rocks, but also very dark rocks. What's the difference between those two?
I would say synthesis pathway.
And is there a difference between the high that you experience between those two, or is it just literally just colour?
MDMA is MDMA.
Okay.
It doesn't really matter if it's MDMA hydrochloride, MDMA sulfate. It's all MDMA. The reason people have different subjective experiences from using different batches is not so much the MDMA, but other drugs that are in it, and particularly in today's day and age. Even in the day, in the 90s, disco biscuits were 60% MDMA and 40% MDA.
MDA, you have to, okay, right. Yeah, I've got a friend of mine who lives in the Gold Coast, and he's taken a lot of MDA, and he says he loves it. But I took it once and just gave me absolute anxiety. I did not enjoy it at all.
Each person to their own. So the reason they add the MDA to MDMA is it gives it a bit more stimulation.
Okay, right.
So because if you've got pure MDMA, a high dose of
sleep.
Yeah, well you start slipping out of your chair. You don't really want to dance.
No.
But you put some MDA on top of that, and it pumps you up a bit. The problem is if you put too much MDA in it, MDA is also a psychedelic.
Yeah, you start
tripping. And so when people say that they've got, trippy biscuits, it's not LSD in it. It's just it's got too much MDA in it.
Yeah, wow, okay. Are you familiar with a dude called Alexander Shulgin?
Am I familiar
I'm
with
asking
Alex?
this because I heard you talking about it on a podcast. I want to talk about him because he seems like a really, really interesting
He's
figure.
my hero.
Yeah, wow, okay. Because he died recently, right, in 2014. So he, from what I was reading, essentially, I'm not sure if I couldn't determine whether or not he was the first to synthesize MDMA or not.
He wasn't the first to synthesize it. It was first synthesized by, I think it was Merck Pharmaceuticals. They were looking at it as a potential appetite suppressant, but it had some adverse effects, which we now...
Getting high as fuck.
So they sort of... It got forgotten about. What Shulgin did, somebody pointed it out to him, but he was already doing research at the time. So Shulgin's work... he was interested in why there's subjective differences between different psychedelic drugs and how does that work at a molecular level in terms of the neurotransmitter systems. And so he was systematic in his work. He started with the mescaline molecule and just systematically tweaked it, creating hundreds of new chemicals that he'd test on himself. And slowly up the dose.
He tested them all on himself,
yes,
did he?
Everything was self-experimentation.
Wow.
If it looked like it was promising, then he'd start involving his wife and a few colleagues, and then they'd have a little dinner party and all report on that. And in doing so, not only did he create hundreds of new compounds that we didn't know about, he wrote about this in a book called Phenethylamines I've Known and Loved, which described the synthesis pathway for each of these drugs, dosage, duration, and at that time he had a license from the Drug Enforcement Agency to do the work that he was doing. The reason he published the book was he was concerned that all of this research that he'd done was going to just get shelved and nobody would find out about it. So he just went out and made it public. The DEA were not happy. They came down, stripped his license, basically trashed his lab, trashed his cactuses.
It's crazy.
And so
which take a very long time to grow.
Yeah, he had peyote. He describes in his next book, Tryptamines I've Known and Loved, which is a response to the DEA doing what they did.
Wow.
Basically, all the work he'd been doing with tryptamine, so doing this with the same idea. Except not really starting with mescaline per se, but just tweaking the different tryptamines. And again, there's hundreds of different tryptamines that he's found, and others have sort of carried on that work. And in doing so, Shulgin's self-experimentation. One, back in those days, that was quite normal. I mean, even the work at UWA, the fellow that won the Nobel Prize, he wouldn't have won the Nobel Prize if he didn't self-experiment.
Yeah, okay.
But we've in our culture, it's taboo now to self-experiment.
Yeah. But it's also, I guess, like obviously very, very dangerous, right? But I mean, like, what sort of, like, how dangerous could it possibly be if you're actually like a legitimate chemist and you know what you're doing? But like, how do you determine, like, with the dosages? Like, do you just start in very, very tiny amounts and slowly start bumping it up?
Exactly. That's Shulgin's method. So you start at a micro milligram range and then leave it for a week.
Okay.
And then up it slightly by micromilligram. And slowly work up until he'd get some adverse effects and go, no, not taking any more of that.
Yeah, okay.
Or this is interesting and just keep upping it until you find the sweet spot and then get some people around and share it with everybody and see what they thought of it.
Wow, okay. So what sort of drug, What compounds was he? What sort of compounds did he make?
2CB, 2CI,
So
2CE.
that entire 2C family, right? Wow.
That's Shogun.
Fuck. That's crazy. Because there's so many versions of 2C.
Yeah.
Right?
Then there's the 2CTs. That's all Shogun. Shogun also developed DOI, DOM, DOC. It just becomes alphabet soup, honestly.
Wow, jeez, okay. Is there much variation between the actual experience from all the different 2C drugs? Because there's so many different versions. Like, how different could they possibly be from each other?
Yeah, I can really only comment on, say, 2CB, 2CI, and 2CE because they're the ones that I'm most familiar with. So 2CB and 2CI are quite similar in that they produce some visual changes. They're entactogenic, empathogenic, similar to MDMA.
Okay.
They're almost like a good drug for people to start with if they're wanting to experiment with a psychedelic because they don't affect cognition too much. So, you feel sort of loved up, but you're not tripping balls, but there's still visuals and stuff on the wall and things are a bit crazy. But even with the difference between a bromine and an iodine atom added at the fifth position of the molecule, so that's the difference between 2CB and 2CI. There are subtle subjective differences that some people will notice and some people will say, I prefer 2CI over 2CB or vice versa. And then 2CE, which I was talking about before, is like a completely different beast. It's not really entactogenic at all. It's very much like mescaline.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about the cognitive change so you can synthesize psychedelics with really specific things in mind, right? So you could do something that you wanted to have heavy visuals, but not a change in your mental state, or you could do the other way around, which would be more similar to LSD.
I think we are at that point where we could do that. I don't think anybody's actually doing that work at the moment.
Well,
They may be. I mean, the last episode of Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia is kind of looking at that work, and they're doing it with computer modeling and then synthesizing it. But based on all of Shulgin's work, we know a couple of things. We know that with a phenethylamine molecule, if you start adding things to the tail of the molecule, you get stimulants. If you start adding things to the benzene ring, you get psychedelic drugs. And if you start adding bits on both ends, you get MDA, MDMA, and all of these other really interesting compounds that are they're both a stimulant and a psychedelic, but they don't fit into either category really well.
Wow, okay. Can you grow peyote, the actual cactus, in Australia? Does it grow here?
Absolutely. And you can purchase seed to grow it. So
that's legal to do? You can do that? Or is it a bit of a grey area?
It's a grey area state by state.
Okay, right.
Western Australia is a bit of a strange case in that it's not specifically outlawed to grow peyote here. Technically, you could be charged depending on the interpretation of the law, because in Western Australia we have the psychoactives clause in our Misuse of Drugs Act, which came about, not funnily enough, but around the time of Preston's death.
Wow. Okay.
And it was to really stop, because at that time 2CI was legal when Preston took it. And so the psychoactive clause was introduced by the WA state government as a way to kind of close the loop, because they were playing this cat and mouse game with synthetic cannabis where they'd ban one cannabinoid
and then they
the
would
next
just make
one.
Another one. Yeah.
And so what they've done in Western Australia is the way the Act reads is anything that has a psychoactive effect is now deemed illegal.
Wow. Okay.
Excluding alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, medications that are approved by the TGA, certain foods, because you can get high on saffron and poppy seeds and other things,
like
and
turmeric as well.
Turmeric, there's lots of different. There's a paper you can download called I can't remember what it's called. It's written by some psychiatrists. Basically, spices you can get high on.
Wow, like spices that people are just used to cooking with. Wow.
Yeah, like nutmeg.
It's
not particular. Nutmeg's not particularly pleasant. But interestingly enough, rabbits have an enzyme that converts the active ingredient in nutmeg into MDMA.
So they eat nutmeg, but then they feel like they've just taken a cap.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. What state in Australia do you feel like has the most liberal drug policies and laws?
Hands down, ACT.
Yeah, because you possess like 50 grams of cannabis or something like on your person at any time and grow a few plants for personal use.
Yeah, and it's completely legal. It's not decriminalised.
What's the distinction between that?
So, if you get caught drink driving, that is a criminal act, and you get a criminal offence. But if you speed, you get a fine. So decriminalisation is like turning it from a drink driving act to a speeding act.
So you just get a fine.
You get a fine.
But you don't get a record.
Exactly.
Okay.
And at the moment in Western Australia, it is a criminal offence to possess cannabis. There was a period where it was decriminalised.
When was that?
The Gallop government decriminalised cannabis. I'm not sure on the dates exactly, but the Barnett government came in and repealed those laws, making cannabis illegal or criminal again here in Western Australia. So we were progressive again, like Australia in general. There's there's bits and pieces that are turning all over the place. But that's essentially the difference. And the difference with the ACT is it's sort of a pseudo-legalisation. So it's not decriminalised, but it's not fully legal because you can't buy or sell cannabis. That would be breaking the laws. So they've got...
But you can possess it, but the actual act of getting it is where the crime comes into it.
Yeah, so the crime, the really interesting part is if you were growing cannabis before they changed the laws, then you are in an ideal position because you're now growing cannabis legally and you can possess it, you can smoke it. You can't give it to anybody, but you can
have it for yourself. Yeah.
If you weren't growing cannabis before they brought in these new laws, how do you get the seeds?
Got to get them from somewhere.
You break the law.
Yeah, well, do you reckon ACT's like that because all the politicians know that their kids are just getting high on drugs and shit?
No, because the people that are voting the politicians in the ACT are the people that live in the ACT. The politicians don't live in the ACT, you know.
They're just there for Parliament.
Exactly.
And then they fuck off.
Your local member lives in your area, and then they... it's a bit more difficult in COVID times, but essentially they spend time in Canberra when Parliament's sitting and then fly back to their electorate.
Wow. So wouldn't it make more sense then to do your type of research in the ACT then? Or is it different for like medical research and all that sort of thing?
It is different for medical research. The ACT has been successful in getting pill testing up with 2 trials now because of some of their laws, but when it comes to cannabis prescribing, I think WA might have higher rates per capita of cannabis prescriptions.
Wow. Medicinal cannabis prescriptions
because of all of these state variations. I think one thing we've really learnt with COVID is we are not a united nation.
No way.
And I knew this before because every state's got different drug policies, and it's just a mess. And COVID really highlights just how messy things are with all of these different states and the different laws. And those laws pertain to, what's deemed criminal and not criminal, what can be used medically, what can't be used medically. So, for example, the worst place you could be doing my sort of research at the moment, I think it'd probably be New South Wales, because in New South Wales, they are really stringent around the administration of Schedule 9 prohibited drugs to humans. So it makes it much more difficult there to do this sort of research. In saying that, though, there's a group at St Vincent's that have got ethics approval to do a study where they're going to give people who are trying to stop taking methamphetamine, psilocybin, so to give them a peak experience on psilocybin and see if that helps assist them with their...
Shock them into sorting their shit out.
It's kind of
a little bit more complicated. A little bit more complicated than that, obviously. But yeah, so psilocybin's used then for drug addiction therapy, right?
Yeah.
Wow, okay.
It's been demonstrated to have good efficacy in an open-label trial at Johns Hopkins for tobacco cessation. So 6-month follow-up, 80% of people in the trial had quit smoking, where if you look at the best pharmaceuticals we have, you're looking at about 20% success rate. So 80% is extremely good. New York University's published data on alcohol use disorder and psilocybin treatment, and they're about to publish a big data set. They've just finished up a really big study, and as far as I'm aware, the data is very promising. I know a group in the US who are looking at psilocybin-assisted treatment for cocaine dependence. So
Wow.
there is a lot happening. It's really hard actually to keep up with what's happening in the science because there is just so many clinical
much
trials
happening,
happening at the moment.
Wow. Have you done much research into ibogaine and also in its effects on opioid addiction? Apparently that's meant to be pretty promising.
Yeah, look, I've got a PhD student who is based in South Africa where ibogaine is a medicine.
Okay.
And so the doctors, GPs can just prescribe it.
How do you take it? Do you eat it?
It's taken orally,
Yeah, okay.
but they're using an extract, not the actual iboga plant itself,
Oh, okay.
because like peyote, iboga is actually
Toxic.
threatened. No, it's a threatened species.
Oh, right.
It's not toxic.
okay.
Yeah, well, it is toxic if you take too
Eat
much
enough,
of it.
yeah. Fair enough.
Unlike other the classic psychedelics, you can't overdose on psilocybin, LSD.
It'd just be impossible to eat that much.
But even if I had look with LSD, my favourite example with LSD is a paper in a medical journal where there were 6 or 7 people in California having a dinner party in the late 60s, early 70s. Someone found a plate which had some white powder on it. They thought it was cocaine, so they racked up some
powdered
lines.
LSD.
Yeah, it was powdered. They took 20,000 doses each.
20,000 doses.
Yeah, the reason it's in a medical journal is because they ended up in hospital. They were discharged the next day.
It'd be like having a lobotomy.
Yeah, well, fortunately though, if that had been any other drug, they'd be dead. But they were all discharged fine the next day. I'm not sure if they were psychologically fine,
There's no
but
way you'd be
physiologically
fine.
Physiologically, they were cleared for discharge.
Yeah, wow. Fuck, 20,000 hits. Yeah, so is powdered LSD still a big thing? Because wasn't that like a sort of like the 80s, 90s sort of thing in the big party scene sort of stuff?
I don't know, to be honest.
Because I've never seen powdered LSD.
I've never come across it either. Yeah. I mean, yeah, liquid LSD and obviously blotter paper, but there's no reason why that you wouldn't have powdered LSD except for the fact that it's so potent. Like, how do you weigh out 100
you need like
mics?
little tiny like amount of powder. You'd have to mix it with something, surely.
Which is why I think we have liquid LSD, and then you put it on blotter paper. It's easy to manage. With lots of drugs that are active at low doses, one of the harm reduction strategies I tell people is exactly that. Mix it with a solvent like alcohol, and that way you can at least measure out a dose, because even with scales, we don't
it's only accurate up to some point.
Yeah, unless you're working in a highly sophisticated laboratory, you can't be measuring out even a milligram. A milligram on the scales, it could be 500 mics, it could be 1,500 mics. Who knows?
Yeah, wow. So are you for? What's your philosophy on decriminalization versus complete legalization? Where do you stand on that for all drugs?
Well, I think we should firstly have decriminalization of all drugs. There's no evidence supporting that the prohibition of drugs is doing anybody any good, except for, I guess, if you work in law enforcement, there's an ongoing stream of funding, or if you work for one of the various institutes like the National Drug Research Institute or the NDARC, the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, they're basically getting funded by the government to demonstrate that these drugs are illegal, that these drugs are harmful, so that we can continue to prohibit them. So there's this, that's kind of where my PhD was coming from. There's these institutions that have a vested interest in keeping these things prohibited, but the evidence from, say, Portugal shows that not only does it not lead to increased use, it means that you can funnel that funding that is now going to supply control, border force and law enforcement, you can funnel that into treatment and education, and so you end up with far better health outcomes. In terms of full legalization, I think it depends on the drug.
Yeah, a bit of a touchy thing.
Like cannabis, for me, it's not a question of whether cannabis should be illegal or should be legal or not. That's not the question. The question is, which model should we use to legalize cannabis? Because there are different models, and I think there's different health outcomes depending on that model.
And you go sort of down like a more private way, like you have like private businesses dispensing stuff, or you sort of go through like a pharmacy or anything like that.
Exactly. So in Uruguay, cannabis is dispensed through pharmacies, and you just You just have to register. Like, you don't need a prescription. You just register and you take in your card to identify yourself, and you can purchase an ounce of cannabis from the pharmacy. In Colorado, it's big business, and
billions and billions of dollars every year.
And I feel like that's going down the pathway we've got with alcohol, and it's going to replicate those same problems.
Okay.
And then there's other models as well. Like in Spain, they have cannabis clubs where it's like the ACT, where it's legal, except you're allowed to swap with each other. And so, like, I give you some seeds and you give me an ounce, and that's completely legal in Spain.
Wow. Okay. What's your views on dabbing, like with the really intense THC oil, with that sort of stuff? Do you feel like that sort of takes it a little bit far, having people with mass access to stuff like that? Or are you sort of with the same philosophy you have with just normal cannabis leaf?
Yeah, I haven't come across a lot of dabbing personally or professionally even. I think it's
definitely a big American thing.
Yeah, I was going to say it's more. It seems to be more popular overseas. Yeah. And I'm familiar with the medical cannabis products that are available, in Australia, and they are actually pretty potent.
Yeah.
In terms of the product that I saw most recently, a high THC product had 20 milligrams of THC per mil. So
is that a lot?
That's a
a fuckload.
Yeah, like if you took a mil of that, and if you're cannabis naive, you'd be on the floor for about 12 to 15 hours. Yeah. Not sick, but just somnolent, like not being able to do or say much for a while.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, but even in those high quality medicinal products, people aren't dabbing per se. It's more just people using them as instructed.
Well, okay. So yeah, like in terms of the medicinal benefits of cannabis, like what sort of medical products do we have available in Australia? So when you get prescribed medicinal cannabis, do you actually get the option to smoke the actual bud itself, or do you just get given tinctures? It just depends. It
used to be just the tinctures. It's now bud.
Wow. And okay. So you can just get the raw bud and you can smoke it.
Yep. You can be prescribed bud and different types of bud. The doctor can choose which bud. And so there's, high THC, high CBD, depending on what condition's being treated. And you're given a vaporizer, or you have to buy a vaporizer, or you're prescribed a vaporizer, I guess would be the best way of describing it.
Wow. Okay. So you have to use it with a vape. You can't have a bong, which would be paraphernalia, yada, 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 all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Wow. And I think that's partly around just the harm reduction. Before medical cannabis came about, we were trying to encourage people to shift away from bongs to use vaporizers, because it's far less harmful to be inhaling. And so if you're a medical practitioner, which I'm not, I suspect that you would not want to be encouraging your patients to be smoking anything. But vaping...
A little bit better. You mentioned vaping. So even with like cigarettes versus like vaping nicotine, are there obvious health benefits to switching to a vape?
100%.
Yeah. Okay.
So the Royal College of Physicians in the UK have demonstrated that vaping is 95% less harmful than smoking tobacco.
95%. Wow, fuck. Okay. But that doesn't mean that it's not harmful.
Well, it's still 5%.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Look, inhaling anything into your lungs is not going to be great.
Okay. So what sort of negative health effects does vaping still have attached to it?
We don't know because it hasn't been around long enough to find out. But what we do know is that it's significantly less harmful than smoking combustible tobacco. And where there have been cases, they're often rare but get a lot of media attention and a lot of sensationalism around those cases. It's often not been to do with nicotine vaping. It's been a CBD product in the US. And it's because the product isn't regulated, and without regulation, there's no quality control, and there were other things in the product that these people were vaping that were causing the deaths.
Wow, okay. So we might wrap up soon, but one thing I wanted to talk to you about before we ended this, have you heard of a guy called Dr. Carl Hart? He works at Harvard as a professor, and he came out publicly saying that he uses heroin recreationally, and it actually makes him a better person and all that sort of thing. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's awesome that he's come out, because, look, you put me on the spot before. I've spent up to 10 minutes on 6PR, having banter back and forth. I've got all my answers. So I decided I wasn't going to go down that pathway, but I could have said, look, I've come here to talk about the evidence and psychedelics, and let's talk about that. Or I could say, look, I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. If I say I have used psychedelics, people will think I'm some hippie just trying to promote them. If I haven't used them, then I don't know how powerful these drugs are. So I'm screwed either way.
Yeah.
I've got so many different ways of answering that question because it's problematic to come out. So I think it's great that people like Carl Hart have come out. I've got colleagues over East as researchers. They're not clinicians, which puts them, like Carl, puts them in a better position to be able to come out. My concern with coming out is it could have an impact on my license to practice.
Yeah, of course.
So Dr. Monica Barrett at RMIT and her colleagues have written a paper where they basically came out and looked at the potential positives and negatives as research is coming out, because for me one of the key positives of maybe not coming out but at least being upfront about where you stand is it allows you to then sort of interpret the research based on that knowledge. So if I know that you are a big fan of pot and you love pot, then I can interpret your research knowing that. But if we don't we're not upfront about this and we're all sort of playing poker faces, then it's harder to interpret and it's harder to know what people's intentions and motivations are for conducting the research that they're doing. So ideally...
Yeah, they might have to hold some sort of internal bias, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And people have staked their careers on MDMA being a dangerous drug, and they continue to write about it being dangerous because they've staked their career on it. Clearly, they haven't taken MDMA.
Yeah,
otherwise, they wouldn't keep writing all these papers on why MDMA is such a bad drug.
Yeah.
So people have staked their careers on it. For whatever reason, we don't always know what people's intent is for conducting research, and so it would be much better if we could just be transparent and just talk about all of this openly. And I use this term coming out quite specifically because I feel like in the psychonautica world, in the where people are experimenting with VR, meditation, psychedelics, psychoactives. I feel like we're about 20 or 30 years behind the LGBTI movement, where it's the same idea where people started coming out. And we've not only has Carl come out, there's a number of famous people that have come out. Oliver Sacks, the neuroscientist, came out just before he died in the New York Times. He wrote a whole article about all his experiments with psychoactives. I think Steve Jobs might have come out. And
Steve Jobs 100% would have been tripping balls back when he was younger.
So and he's been upfront about it. The guys that came up with the DNA helix have talked about how their psychedelic experience informed that.
Wow, I didn't know that. Wow, that's crazy. So do you feel like it's obviously there are many people who work at universities, who do research, who are also clinicians and medical practitioners themselves that do use illicit drugs?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well,
absolutely. And I've seen it happen. I've been in rooms where people are doing this, but we can't talk about it because it's a taboo.
Yeah.
And the only time, this goes back to my PhD research, the only way you can get away with talking about we can't talk about current drug use for a start, and if you talk about past drug use, then you have to have this sort of remorse and a story of redemption.
I've come away from that now.
And now I'm a better person for it, and now I'm doing all these good things. And so you see these stories in the media, but we don't. There's no space in our current society for people to just come out and say, you know what, I enjoy. I was going to say I enjoy a spliff on a Friday night, but Carl took it a little bit further with heroin. Which was, I think, was a good move because push a little bit harder, and then I think maybe we can. I mean, I've been at cannabis conferences where it was clear that half of the people there smoked pot and half didn't. There was the pro people and the anti people. The people that were saying pot was bad were the people that didn't smoke pot
and have never smoked it before.
Never smoked it before. The ones that were pro, and the conference I'm thinking of in New Zealand, they had synthetic cannabis available legally at the point of time when I was at this conference. And after a few drinks, this fellow was saying, oh, yeah, I tried some last night, horrible stuff. I had an awful experience. It turns out he smoked too much and he got lost and he couldn't find his way back to the hotel. Yeah. But he also said, and I smoked pot quite frequently. He's very passionate about his pot use after a few drinks, of course, and not to the public. But yeah, so clearly people that are doing research in this area, they're doing it for a reason, and it would be better to be transparent about why we're doing the research, what brought us into this area in the first place. Because even my own story, I mean, what brought me here was seeing the harmful effects of particularly methamphetamine on my friends and myself, and that's what brought me here. But still, my position has changed significantly since that's what drew me in. I think if we can be more transparent about what's drawn people in, because nobody works in this field just randomly. It's not an area you just decide.
You just stumble across.
I just stumbled across this field. No, people. And I think people that are anti have had similar experiences to mine, though they haven't sort of done that 180 that I've done and realised that hold on, the evidence actually doesn't support this. You know that we should be doing things the way that we're doing them at the moment, and maybe we should reconsider that. So when I first came to uni, I had to do this real 180 and change my perspective, and then I guess that's what informed my PhD. And I think unless we're transparent about why we're doing what we're doing, it makes it really difficult to interpret what the data means, because I think we, as scientists, we want to think that we're wearing lab coats and we're being objective, but even quantum physics has an observer effect. There's always going to be subjectivity there. And so what I like to do in my research is, rather than try to control everything to the nth degree, I just accept this subjectivity and I try to be upfront about my subjectivity. I haven't quite come out in that respect, but I'm pretty upfront about where I sit, and therefore I allow the reader to interpret my research and my data and my interpretation of the data based on my position.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I think that might be a great way to wrap it up. One quick question I want to ask. Should a prime minister be forced to, before they take office, to go through an ayahuasca experience? Yes or no? My answer is yes.
I don't know. No, the reason why I am so conscious of this, not just saying yes, is it is complex, and I'll try to give you a bite-sized answer.
Okay.
Psychedelics in some people actually firm up narcissism. And I've seen this, and there's evidence for it. So if we give Trump LSD, it's going to make him worse.
Okay, wow, that's a great answer.
So I don't think we want to make it mandatory, because we will end up with some very good politicians and some really fucked up politicians.
Wow, okay. Wow. All right, that's a great way to wrap it up. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was great to meet you. Thanks.
Thanks for the chat.
No worries.